Hey guys, it's BlockchainBrad, and today I'm talking with someone I've wanted to talk to for so long. It's Matt Spoke he's the CEO of Nuco, and he's also the founder of AION. So Matt, we are so excited to have you on the channel. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much, Brad. Yeah, it's a pleasure being here.
So Matt, obviously you are the CEO of Nuco, but we're going to focus on AION today. You're the founder. Matt, can we start with what is AION? What exactly is it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, maybe to do that, I'll give you like a little bit of background context on who we are, who I am, just because I think it kind of tells the story a little bit. I mean, I came into this space in 2014 with a very specific focus on how are distributed ledgers going to impact like the enterprise markets and like the incumbents that we all work with on a day-to-day basis, right? Banks and insurance companies and governments and everything. So, years of doing that, we came across like a number of very real problems that needed to be solved. That people often bucket into like high-level topics like scalability and privacy and all of these types of fundamental issues that had not yet properly been solved. What we stumbled on more recently, kind of early 2017, was the fact that the biggest challenge for scalability is that we're not building towards one blockchain in the future. We're building towards multiple blockchains in the future. So if we're going to scale businesses and scale processes and applications on top of these multiple blockchains, then the interoperability of those networks is going to be fundamentally, critical to success.
Right.
So that's what we started building. Like, how do we build a scalable solution, a solution that can be applicable both to the mainstream enterprise market as well as the public crypto markets, and a system that allows for the interconnectivity of different blockchains together.
Right, and Matt, obviously I've read through your very impressive credentials. You worked for Deloitte for quite some time. You had a lot of experience there. So how fundamental was that to move forward into this venture?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit of an unusual background compared to people I meet in the space. I mean, I'm a chartered accountant by education. I used to do international tax planning for Deloitte at like a corporate level. A lot of that is, what most people would say irrelevant for coming into the tech industry. But the fact of the matter is that running a company is complicated. I mean, I've been learning a lot of first-time lessons. And I think it's been an education and a background that has kind of equipped me for that. My last 2 years at Deloitte were when I started getting into the blockchain. So my last 2 years at Deloitte were I was leading an R&D team called Rubix. And that was exclusively focused on, what does this technology do to the types of clients that Deloitte services around the world, right? So from a financial reporting perspective, but also just general process management perspective. So that's what was kind of my first, stepping stone into the industry. That is what led me to the realization that there was a gap in the market for a solution focused on the enterprise market, and eventually focused on how do you connect the enterprise market to the rest of the crypto markets. And that's what kind of led us to AION. Now we're building a whole bunch of things under that umbrella name of AION, but that was kind of the catalyst up front.
Right, and Matt, what I like about you is that you do have that blockchain experience, because it wasn't just Deloitte, but you did a project with them specifically on blockchain. So Matt, if we talk about specifics in terms of AION, let's talk about it in terms of interoperability and also in terms of its Generation 3 blockchain structure.
Sure. So yeah, let me start with Generation 3, as you put it. There's kind of three broad categories that we talk about when we're thinking about what does a fundamentally different blockchain solution look like. And I kind of bucketed these things into the enterprise market that we came from. So when you look at the enterprise market on the blockchain side, you run into companies like IBM, you run into companies like Digital Asset Holdings and Chain.com, very focused on that concept of and Ripple of like enterprise networks, a way for enterprises to kind of connect more efficiently with each other.
Like consensus.
And I think that's critically important. The second piece, though, is like public smart contracting systems. So, Ethereum kind of paved the way with this, but now you've got networks like Neo and Quantum and a whole bunch of other networks that have kind of said, hey, we're gonna layer on top, new functionalities and new concepts, but still on the basis of a public smart contracting system.
Right.
And then the third is if those two domains are going to coexist, how do you connect them to each other? So when AION is essentially designed to be the solution that really touches on all three of those domains. And that's where we think we're unique. We're not simply an enterprise solution. We're not simply a public network that allows for smart contracts to execute. And we're not simply a way to connect blockchains. We're all three of those things. And if we can get that right, I think we unlock an enormous opportunity for what the future of this infrastructure is going to look like in our minds.
I totally agree. And to simplify that down even further, let's unpack AION 1, because that's really the core of what you're talking about. That's the core blockchain plan.
Yeah, so AION one's a great example. I mean, AION, we kind of play it out in a couple of different, depending on how you look at it, it kind of is different things to different people. So AION one is and will be a public blockchain on top of which you can build applications and execute, software and build smart contracts, et cetera, right? So that's as a standalone public blockchain. AION one will also have built into it the ability to instantiate and create bridges that essentially create that connectivity to other blockchains, whether they be AION or non-AION blockchains, right? So that's the role of AION one as like a connector rather than as it's a standalone blockchain. The third piece is the AION code base is able to get redeployed kind of over and over and over again to build and launch new blockchains. So you don't need to build on this one standalone blockchain. I mean, in fact, we think there's a lot of really good reason to be building new blockchains for new industries and new applications. So, you take that concept of AION and you say, well, I'm going to connect to AION one, but I'm going to use the AION code base to build my own network that connects to AION one. So that's kind of where we see probably three different categories of users. Users that are going to come in and say, I want to build on top of this public network. Users that are going to come in and say, I want to build a bridge between these public networks, or users that are going to come in and say, I want to use this code base to build my own network, whether I connect it back in or not. There's nothing stopping somebody from just building it as an isolated system. So that's kind of the three categories of engineers and kind of projects that we're focusing on. So on the enterprise side, it tends to be that, hey, they want to start off by building their own network. With like a roadmap intention at some point to connect it back into the public ecosystem.
Right.
In the public domain, when we deal with like, public, startups that are building kind of public crypto applications, they might want to build it directly on top of our public system. So we're getting a lot of interest on all three fronts. But I think that's what we like to think is kind of our unique proposition is that we can be multiple things to multiple people rather than only a single solution.
And Matt, honestly, I mean, I know we're pressed for time because you're very busy, but the scope of what you just said is absolutely massive. And that's simply because you're catering for enterprise markets. You're catering literally for the biggest businesses you can imagine, given that you can on-sell the protocol, you can on-sell the fundamentals so that they can utilize what already exists through you. They don't need to go and set up their own blockchains from the start. And that's why that's so valuable. And there are obviously other blockchains doing that, but there are very few. And so with that, in that respect, let's talk about permissioned versus permissionless, aspects of trust and trustlessness. You're building that into your system. Is that fair to say? You're catering for both sides?
I mean, I see these terms, these are essentially from our design, these are like network configurations, right? So a network configuration meaning like I can configure my network to operate on a completely open public consensus mechanism, or I can configure my network to operate on a closed private consensus mechanism. And these are network configurations. So we're building for the flexibility of those configurations. So regardless of what your requirement is, we haven't exclusively prioritized things like implicit privacy on the network, but it's something that we intend to add in as a configuration. So you can say, hey, I need this network to have privacy kind of rooted in it as like a core feature. So that's the type of flexibility we want to allow. When we looked at the market and we said, we don't want to be an enterprise blockchain company because we think they're missing the mark in terms of like long-term potential of what a public technology looks like.
Right.
But nor do we want to be exclusively a public crypto technology. So, and nobody seemed to be focusing on what's the intersection. Where does the enterprise and the mainstream world meet the public?
Exactly.
Public world. And can you build a solution that kind of has embedded in its DNA characteristics that could solve the requirements of both parties? Because I think when we kind of zoom out and say, what does the next 10 years look like? I think it's a very, very complex but integrated system of private and public networks coexisting and passing data and passing transactions back and forth between each other in all sorts of domains and industries and in all sorts of countries.
Exactly.
So if that's our long-term hypothesis, then how do we build those building blocks essentially up front? And that's what we're focusing on.
Right, and obviously you are that interconnector, that connective and conduit for those two, I guess, the public blockchain and also the private component. Let's talk specifically about things like Hyperledger. Let's talk about the Ethereum Enterprise Alliance. Let's talk about consensus, all of these consortium-based models. Where are you going with them? Are you going to build alliances with them?
Yeah, so I mean, as a lot of people probably are aware, if they've looked into us as a company, I mean, we've been very involved at the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance from its origination. I mean, I sit on its board of directors. We're one of the founding companies. I think that's an important role in the market today, is to continue that education curve for these large institutions to get more and more comfortable with this technology. Enterprise Ethereum started off on the premise that it meant enterprise Ethereum could be equated to private Ethereum, private Ethereum networks.
Exactly.
And what did we need to build private Ethereum networks? Increasingly, internally among that group of members, and we're 350 odd members at the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, the topic is shifting, right? It's not exclusively private networks. It's private networks and the use of public networks and potentially the intersection of both. I mean, we're fundamentally very supportive of the vision that Ethereum created for the world. This world that we can have trusted, not only trusted transaction systems, but trusted computation systems on a global basis. There's not only one way to architect these systems, and there's not only one way to kind of deploy them. So, we're proposing an alternative solution that allows for some very similar concepts to play out with different characteristics attached to it. So I think there's going to be synergies between the work we've done at Enterprise Ethereum. We're very close to a lot of the leadership at the Hyperledger project. Obviously is backed by the Linux Foundation primarily. So because it's got such an open source focus, I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity for us to work hand in hand with them as well. So I don't see these things as being in any way competitive to what we're doing. I mean, our objective would be that we can design generically enough bridges that could connect to any type of network, whether they be Ethereum in their DNA or Hyperledger in their DNA or anything else.
It's fascinating.
So that's kind of.
And Matt, how imperative is your relationship with Vitalik? Because obviously you're both from Canada. I'm aware that you do communicate with him. Do you find that that's an advantage for your company?
I mean, I'm careful on this topic because I know the market kind of plays this up, probably more than they
maybe we should just clarify it then.
Yeah, and I mean, Vitalik is a friend. Vitalik has been very close to the company since we launched it. I mean, we've definitely tapped him as a resource when we've had architectural ideas that we wanted to get like a third party to kind of opine on. But I don't want to give anybody the impression that on a daily or weekly basis he's walking through the halls of our office actively participating in what we're building. He's not. I mean, he is from Toronto. His family is here, but he also is only here maybe 2-3 times a year. He's generally kind of globe-trotting and spending a lot of time in Southeast Asia. So there is a great relationship there. And we're very fortunate to have that relationship. I continue to think that he's definitely, in my mind, the most relevant thought leader and trailblazer in our industry. But I don't want to overplay his role in the active development of AION. That would not be fair to say. Matt,
I respect your answer. In many ways, I see you as colleagues because one of the reasons I say that is because you are establishing your own DApp-based blockchain, and so in that respect, it's obviously collegial knowledge that you can share. Much like you'd be at uni and you're sharing ideas when you're doing an essay or something. So I think it's really, really great you explained that. If we go across now to something that's a hot topic with WANCHAIN, obviously, and with ICON. This really surprised me actually because I knew a lot about the interoperability of those as well. Why on earth did you do that?
Well, I mean, our probably core hypothesis is there's a lot of novel problems to solve, and it doesn't serve anybody to try to reinvent the wheel 10 times over. So, we're actually looking at other opportunities on other layers of our architecture to collaborate with companies on different parts of our technology. I think we're going to get to a point in this industry where there's going to be the best practices established on how to do certain things, and to try to go and reinvent those things over and over and over again, which tends to be kind of the status quo right now, is not an efficient use of resources for any of us. I mean, we want to see the industry move forward. So our relationship with ICON and WANCHAIN is kind of a demonstration of that, saying, hey, we all collectively agree that there's a need for better interoperability among networks for whatever use case. Obviously, WANCHAIN is working a lot more on like token swaps between networks, but still there's like some common characteristics of how do you exchange messages and validation across networks. Right. So, our hope with them is that we can actually establish, what those best practices are together, and not to say, hey, we're this insular group of only 3 projects. The goal would be that becomes broadly the standard for anybody and everybody working on this type of problem in the industry. Similarly, we've got other layers of our system that we'd like to talk to other companies about. I mean, we're working on a very ambitious roadmap for our virtual machine, and there's other companies working on really interesting ideas for how to implement a virtual machine. So to the extent that we can share resources, we also are starting to engage a lot more with academic institutions to make sure that we're wherever we can find advantages on existing research, existing development by other companies, we're going to take those advantages because we want to make sure that we're being efficient in our delivery. We're not out there to prove that we're better than everybody. We're out there to build the strongest possible solution, and that might include pieces of other people's solution, if that makes sense.
So Matt, would it be fair to say that also one of the reasons why you did make that alliance was to consolidate your position in the market? Because obviously it's about readiness. It's about making sure that you are available to the space with your technology. And also, given that you have divergent protocols, you are distinct, is the primary reason is that it does consolidate all three of you in the market, your positions?
So, no, and I mean, you know, we have some intents this year to work on how do we create that interconnectivity between our three networks as an interesting starting point, right? As a starting point to say, hey, not only are we talking about interoperability, we're proving it amongst ourselves. Hey, look how I interoperate between an ICON Nexus-based system and, you know, and WANCHAIN. And AION, obviously. So, you know, that's kind of attempt number one, is to prove that within that kind of microcosm of a few projects, we can achieve interoperability efficiently. And then if we can extrapolate on that, that means we can do it efficiently with any project in the market.
I see.
This is not, you know, there's nothing beyond that has been thought out. We really are at the point now where we've looked into each other's roadmaps enough, and we've uncovered, you know, we've shared a lot of notes about our technical priorities, that we've uncovered that there was enough similarity in how we were all approaching certain problems that we were better off just having an open conversation and saying, hey, my engineer's working on something, you have an engineer working on something similar. Why are they not talking to each other more frequently to trade best practices and ideas? That's kind of the state of that relationship right now. We couldn't be happier. I mean, these are two kind of world-class teams. The other kind of looser value proposition on top of that is that, you know, we're all trying to grow a global awareness of what we're doing. So, you know, there's a nice geographical distribution between the three of us where we can start to kind of support each other in community engagement efforts, right? I can go to Asia and have, you know, direct access to the great community that WANCHAIN is building out of their office in Beijing, and the team at ICON getting built in Seoul, Korea. Obviously, ICON's got a big presence in the United States, WANCHAIN has a big presence in the United States as well. So for us, it's like, there's certain things that are not worth us being standalone and unique. If we can share community relationships, if we can share, you know, meetup groups and that type of thing, we're going to do that because it advantages all of us. So that's kind of the purpose.
That's awesome. So obviously the geography is really important in that respect, and you've isolated a market, particularly in Canada and the US. If we can obviously move on now, and let's talk about the smart contracts and dApps. What's the plan in terms of right now? My understanding is you don't have a functioning dApp system yet, but how far away are we from that? Because the reason why I mention is there are other blockchains like Cardano, for example, that are on the verge of doing so.
Above part of our first release, we'll have a fully supported kind of ability to build decentralized applications on top of it. So, you know, and that's going to be a constantly moving target because, you know, we've got some, and for those of you paying attention to our roadmap, I mean, we've got a current version of the VM that we're using, which has kind of got modifications off of the Ethereum virtual machine as a kind of a phase one. And then we've got our long-term plans on how we intend to build our virtual machine for the future. But we will be able to support dApps on top of that first version of our network immediately. I mean, It's launching as a test network. It's launching. It'll then subsequently launch as like a live rewarding network. You know, sometime, you know, in the first half of this year for sure. We're hoping that happens kind of earlier than, you know, quote unquote, the first half of this year. The one thing we're learning is that there's an enormous amount of challenge that we're running into on a very frequent basis that requires huge scale and huge amounts of resources, right? So we're very actively hiring to grow our engineering team because everything we do, we want to be able to like triple check it in like a proper quality assurance process to make sure once it's released, there's as few issues and bugs as possible. So we're just being extra diligent on everything we build that goes through our core kernel team. But you can expect that in our first release. Yeah,
I've actually been following you, and I noticed that your team very rarely has holidays, and they had one recently for a short vacation. But Matt, I want to talk about scalability. That's a huge issue, on-chain and off-chain. What are you doing to redress the issues of scalability in your blockchain plan?
So, you know, without diving in too specifically, because, you know, there'll be documentation and kind of more information that comes out with the release. But, you know, there's a lot of work getting done at the database layer to make sure that we're thinking about scalability as we design what the database layer of our system looks like. And then, you know, more broadly than that, I don't actually think interoperability and scalability are two different topics. I think interoperability is a step towards scalability. So,
right.
And what I mean by that is if you're having challenges scaling on a single network, then the one obvious answer to me is multiply the networks, and that becomes scalability, right? So if that's true, then all of a sudden interoperability becomes the key to a scalable system. So we're kind of looking at those two things under one bucket. But scalability on the system, we do focus pretty heavily on the performance of our virtual machine, processing transactions through there. We are focusing on how do we design that database layer to make sure that it can handle the scale of a growing network more efficiently than some existing public networks. So those are kind of the two big topics.
Awesome. And that's really exciting. So obviously you are addressing the issue of scalability, but let's compare it in terms of TPS right now. What's the design in terms of and the tech? Let's talk about proof of intelligence as well. How relevant is the tech, and how fast are you right now?
So proof of intelligence is definitely one of the longer term research projects that we're working on. So it's not included in any of our first releases. It's not in any way kind of something that we intend to kind of put out into the market, in the near future. It's something that we're operating on kind of the basis of a research project. Lots of interesting implementation and development happening around proof of intelligence, but it's a very, very ambitious goal. So, to tie together the concept of neural networks as a function of how do you prove transactions on a system is a long-term ambitious goal that we have that we're putting some resources to.
So Matt, currently, just to interject, you're currently a proof of stake, just so everyone's clear.
No, our first release is actually releasing as
proof of work.
So, again, there's the long-term AION, there's the immediate releases. Our first release is releasing as a proof of work network.
Right.
It's then migrating over to a delegated system that as we've kind of articulated in our white paper. In terms of, we don't really measure ourselves as on the basis of TPS because it varies very heavily depending on network traffic and network scale. It's a very difficult thing to benchmark because if you run like a single node of a new technology and you compare it against like a global distributed system like Ethereum, it's not a fair comparison. You're never talking apples to apples. But we do look at just efficiency of the VM and how can we improve on the efficiency of the VM. So right now we're working towards 30 to 50% efficiency improvements at the VM layer to what you might find on another public kind of smart contracting system. But again, these are steps towards a very long-term engineering roadmap. So I'm constantly trying to remind people that these are very, very complicated technologies that will take years and years and years to get complete. Release number one is exactly that. It's release number one of many. So people should just kind of keep that perspective in mind when they're looking at what we're building. Yes, exactly. We're not in the crypto space, we're in the blockchain space. So Matt, obviously you're really focused on the longitudinal design. And you mentioned obviously that scalability has flux in itself, but let's talk about partnerships as well, because right now we're seeing partnerships emerge with blockchain, main chains, and other protocols that can facilitate that. Are you looking at any partnerships that can enhance your performance, specifically at the technological level? When you say performance, you're talking about processing power? It can be processing power. It could even be to improve on-chain scalability. For example, I won't name names, but I know of some companies that are looking at that right now. Sure. Yeah, and I won't name any names either because it's premature. But we do have some discussions happening around how do we work towards a better, more standardized, scalable, performing VM on chain. And there's a couple of other companies that we're opening that discussion with to see if we can kind of, again, on the same sort of broad topic as how we're working on the Interoperability Alliance. If we have a shared group of a shared list of priorities to work up with a few other projects on those same priorities. So we probably will be disclosing something. There's nothing kind of imminent. I don't like setting expectations because this market can be crazy. Yes. But we've been working on that behind the scenes. So Matt, that's exciting. Let's talk about partnerships, real world ones. I noticed that when I was reading about you initially, you had real world projects, real world interest from Fortune 500 companies. So let's talk about that in the real world of centralized business. They're interested. So we've made some mention of projects that we've been working with that we're allowed to disclose publicly. As you can imagine, when you work in the enterprise space, you're tied to a lot of confidentiality and NDA type agreements. As these projects emerge, we will make the community aware. Once we're allowed to make the community aware, I can say, and I've mentioned this broadly and specifically before, we are very actively working with Moog Industries, which a lot of people know that we've been working on, which is a really interesting customer to be working with and really interesting project that they've got us involved in. We are working very heavily in the financial services industry in North America. I can't name specifically which institutions, but a group of institutions that we're working towards a solution on. We are, as some people picked up on last year, working in the telecom space in Europe, and that's been an exciting project. And we've had some work in the government sector, mostly in Canada at this point, but we've got some interesting opportunities in the government sector opening up in other parts of the world as well. And I mean, I think a lot of people are familiar with the work we've done historically with the Toronto Stock Exchange, and there continues to be a really good relationship there, looking for what that next phase of involvement looks like from them. We've got a very healthy pipeline of what we're trying to focus on more and more and more is finding third-party companies that want to build a variety of solutions on top of AION, not just a single solution on top of AION. So we do have, development shops and integration firms and these types of things that we're starting to kind of formalize relationships with, so they become part of our ecosystem.
I imagine you have a very long email list, Matt, because I'm sure there's a lot of businesses interested in you. But let's talk about some advisors. This is really important. We're going to talk about the Tapscots. And that's because one of them was an advisor for ICON and one was for the advisor for you. So obviously it was very fascinating to hear about the alliance that followed through.
Sure.
How important is that alliance? And obviously the Tapscots are very important, influential people in the blockchain space.
I mean, that was almost, it was helpful. In fact, Alex, who's an advisor of ours, has been very, helpful to the company over the course since we founded the company, essentially. Was the one who first introduced me to the team at The Loop, and The Loop is the company that launched the ICON project. So, he's the one who kind of spurred that relationship. So it was obviously a helpful starting point. Beyond that, it was really just the synergies of our technical focus that led to a relationship between us and ICON.
Okay.
But we're very close with the Tapscots, both junior and senior. Alex plays a continued active role in helping us kind of bring opportunities to the table. So
that's interesting. So Matt, let's move across again from the Tapscots now into the government. You alluded to this before, you did discuss it, but I need to go deeper. It's clear that there's funding relations, there's connections of funding, there's connections of support directly. And I don't want to FOMO this, so I want to make sure that all the listeners understand that. We're not trying to say something, the word the government, and suddenly everyone go and buy ICON, or AION rather. It's more about trying to be really clear that you do have that support. Is that fair to say, even at a local level?
I mean, for those listeners who are familiar with Canada, I mean, we're very fortunate. We have a very supportive government structure for innovation in the startup industry in general. So, I mean, we do have the support of a few levels of government here in Canada. We are working on some government-related projects that involve government agencies as clients. But there's also just more broadly a very healthy ecosystem of like government funding, both at the grant level as well as becoming clients to startups. That's just kind of a general standard practice in Canada of how the government kind of supports new emerging technologies. So we're fortunate. Canada's got a great setup for us, and we're happy to be here. Awesome,
Matt. If we could just talk also about an important aspect of blockchain, as it's always been from the beginning, and that's security. How do you address that really, robustly in your design so that it is one of the most secure, potentially most secure blockchains of the future?
Well, I'd say, process-wise, there are a couple of concepts, right? So one, we're constantly looking to like how are people innovating on security in the industry and making sure that there's not a single topic out there that we're not familiar with and aware of, and at least considering whether it fits into our roadmap. So to the extent that there are like great fundamental improvements in security that happen on a blockchain protocol, you can be confident that it's going to become part of a deliberation as to whether that makes its way into our roadmap.
Right.
More broadly than that, though, I mean, we're building this team on the basis of like continuous improvement and continuous releases. We published a roadmap that kind of articulated what the next year and a half to 2 years looks like. The reality is that these are never-ending evolving systems, right? So you constantly have to be figuring out how do you improve And security is a huge layer of that. So, we've got structured into our team is who's focusing on current release, current maintenance, and current design, and who's focusing on researching those core aspects that are going to make their way into future release and future design.
Right.
So that's just the way we've architected our team from an organizational perspective, is to make sure that there's never a point in time where we're so heads down focused on a single release that we're losing track of like what is a feature that we need to be building 5 years from now, and how do we start researching that now to make sure that we're prepared for that in the future. And that applies across all aspects of the technology, not just security, but obviously it's relevant there as well.
That's interesting, Matt. So if we move across now to the token itself, I wanted to ask you this in terms of the concept of fuel. And the reason why is because throughout the readings it suggests that you are designing yourself in many ways like an economy. Obviously far different from the superficial layers of crypto itself. And with that respect, I would argue that the fuel itself is the token as your ecosystem evolves. So can you talk to that a little bit and what you envisage for this token as a representation of the ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, happy to, and I think we've done a relatively in-depth job, and this will constantly evolve over time as to like what's the role of a coin in a distributed system, and high level it comes down to incentivization of different actors and security. So if that incentivization leads to the right type of behavior among the participants in a network, then it leads to greater security and greater distribution of kind of power, which is the point in decentralized systems. So the fact that you need that token to actively build applications and to actively build bridges is just kind of a representation of that being put into practice. So people have to participate in the system, have an economic incentive to participate in the system, and as a result, they collectively improve the security of the system.
Right.
So that's what that's kind of the core design of any blockchain system that's in the public space, is understanding that this is not simply a technology. This is an economic innovation, right? This is an innovation that says, well, how do we pull the levers of economics to make sure that we can create more secure systems? And that's fundamental to everything that we do on all layers of our architecture, is think about those economic incentives to make sure that that's considered. This is not just about technical design.
Right, and Matt, let's talk about that in comparison to some of the centralized models of shares, because this is important and it's not raised enough in these discussions, in that the model itself is designed to appreciate in value as the ecosystem builds, much like you would see a shareholding as, for example, a Berkshire Hathaway. I often use that analogy with really, really good quality ecosystems like yours is going to become. In that respect, can you see the nuances or the synergies between a centralized share-based model, where you have stock exchanges that are, where people are investing in those, and companies like yours, rather than these simply SOV models, where they're a store of value and that's it?
Yeah, I think the big difference is that like being a shareholder there's no utility to that, right? Like it's simply a mechanism of participating in ownership, and there's no active participation in like day-to-day activity. What's interesting about token systems is that you kind of align the interests of the value of the system that's being created and the users of the system that are actively building. So it's kind of like, to use a probably inappropriate analogy or comparison, is like if you can imagine a company building itself so that its shareholder and its customer was the same person. And,
right.
and in this context, it's like the utility of the network being first and foremost, and as a result of that utility, driving value to the participants. So that's kind of the big difference that I see. Yeah.
That's awesome. And Matt, just to wrap up, obviously you have a huge plan, you have a very longitudinal perspective. What's the thing you want to sort of mention to the listeners as an endpoint for this discussion for the next steps in the roadmap? What's coming?
I mean, stay tuned. We'll be publishing, as we see, appropriate. We'll be publishing kind of updates on the project, and we're trying to do that as frequently as we can to keep you informed. Broadly, for anybody following this industry, especially people who are coming into the industry for the first time, it's really important to understand, one, why this is massively transformative to every aspect of our society, but also two, why, because of that transformative potential, it's going to be a long game, and
yes.
Keep that in mind on all aspects of your thinking and discussions. This is not a 2018 opportunity. This is a decade-long opportunity, and people need to align their expectations to that time horizon. So that's kind of the two things that I would leave them with.
Awesome. Matthew Spoke, it's been an absolute pleasure. CEO of Nuco, the founder of an incredible blockchain of not just now but the future, AION and AION. Thank you so much for your time, Matt. Appreciate it, and hopefully we can talk again soon.
Thanks so much, Brad. Talk to you soon.